Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms Podcast. Very excited. I'm going to talk to Tim Keefe today, who first heard about when my friend James Sullivan talked to him on his James and the Giant podcast. They did three very detailed episodes about postmodernism and the history of modernism and how it leads into postmodernism. And we're going to talk today based on Tim's suggestions, the sociology of porn, complexity theory, and postmodernism. So, all very interesting topics. So, yeah, why don't you just say a little bit about yourself there, Tim? I know you have a master's degree in philosophy too, which is also interesting. So, yeah, why don't you just say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Tim Keefe, and I currently live in Washington, D.C. So I've been a student off and on of philosophy for well over 25 years, starting when it was my major when I was an undergrad, and I had a history minor. And then I went on to graduate school in philosophy because I wanted to be a professional academic one day, and then wisely I backed out of that and did other things. But I still kept up the reading. And the time that I spent when I was an undergraduate and a graduate school really gave me the grounding of approaching academic texts, which is where a lot of philosophy is locked up. You don't find very much of it out there in layman's lands, except recently with the rise of social media, YouTube, Facebook, podcasts, and so on. And yeah, so I have wide-ranging interests. Because of the explosion of the internet, it gives me access to a lot of things that, from many years ago, I hadn't read since then, and it's just been a godsend. I wish this would have existed when I was in grad school, but as I said, that part of the training is that I spent a lot of time in the library, just looking at different books, reading a little bit here and there, and then of course writing, very writing intensive, so that just sharpened my my critical faculties.
Awesome. Yeah, I benefit a lot from the internet age now too. Like those three books that you sent me online, for example, you wouldn't have been able to do that earlier. And it's so great to be able to basically, especially with a lot of the older philosophical texts, just find them for free online. And it really provides a an easy way to learn a lot by reading a lot.
That's true. But also what helps is if you know where to go in the library. So
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
if like where I live in DC, I have access to 4 academic libraries, really top
Oh,
notch.
wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Unfortunately, you have to pay as a patron to get access to the books, but you can
Oh,
walk into the
wow.
stacks and read them for free.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, so all right. So where do you want to get started with what we were going to talk about?
Well, so we decided for this one we were going to continue the conversation that I did with James on postmodernism. But to
Yeah.
do that, since you are a new participant in the conversation, you could probably start off with some questions or comments that you had on the marathon that James and I did with postmodernism.
Well, um I don't know. There's there's so much there, but I I know one thing that we talked about in relation to what you and James were talking about was I think it was simulacra and simulation was one thing that interested me because I had heard before that that was one of the inspirations for the Matrix movies, and that's one thing that we were talking about too. So that's interesting as well. And there's so many other different things like how modernism led into postmodernism and so many things that helped my understanding too, like about how, especially on your most recent episode and all the other episodes too, you were talking about how we were living in a modern era and then now we're living in a postmodern era and why that is and what that means and all sorts of stuff like that. And I was remembering, and Bauman is really interesting too. I like the sociological approach, which, as you were saying, and I think one or two of the episodes is a really interesting and important way to look at the postmodern era, because it looks at how it affects culture and how culture has changed. And yeah, I was just and it was I'm glad that you gave me those three book suggestions to look at before we talked. That Bauman book that you were discussing with James, I forget what it's called actually, but then that one about complexity theory as well, and then that other shorter one about by Bauman, talking about how it's a struggle to find ethics, or to find a moral compass now that we live in the postmodern era, because the religious institutions and government used to provide a more strict ethical code, and now that doesn't happen so much anymore. So yeah, that's basically all of that is just comments that I was thinking of that maybe you could elaborate on a little more if you want to.
Sure. I'll go ahead and give a synopsis of what James and I had talked about. So
Sure.
the main reason why I wanted to address postmodernism was because we've heard it recently. We've
Yes.
heard, particularly Jordan Peterson has brought it up, and he singles out Derrida and Foucault as the, quote, high priests of postmodernism. But me having encountered this many years ago, and me being a trained academic philosopher, more or less, really took offense to this, because it was one more example of a public intellectual, we'll say, who was very sloppy in his research.
Yes.
And in a way, I'm thinking he should know better. But of course, he's a psychologist, and that's not really his field. So but then he relied on that one text explaining postmodernism, which
Stephen Hicks, right?
Stephen Hicks,
Yeah.
which Cuck Philosophy did a really excellent takedown criticism of,
Yeah, I
because
saw
I
that.
didn't
That was
I didn't read
great.
through the entire book, but just flipping through the pages is like, this guy has got a really superficial treatment of it.
Hmm.
And so I thought, hey James, how about we talk about this? Because you and I kind of have a beef with Peterson, even though we like some of the things he says. Let's go ahead and discuss this and try to set the record straight, more or less. And so then I drew upon my knowledge, because I first became aware of postmodernism sometime around in the early 90s when I was an undergraduate. And that was around the time when you started to hear more of, particularly academics, talking about what's all this postmodernism thing. And it really started within, I'd say, like the mid 80s going on to the mid 90s, and then it tapered off a little bit. And then the 2000s, you really didn't hear too much about it. Now it's resurfaced. So, okay. And, listening to people like Peterson is just like, well, wait a minute. I read about this, and I kind of followed it way back in the day. And they're trotting it out kind of as a straw man. Okay,
Yeah.
here's everything that's wrong with the current academy. We're going to straw man because it's postmodernism and identity theory and all of those things, which in some respects is an outgrowth of that. But you straw man, and then you set it to the side, and then you get on with your own agenda, shall we say.
Yeah.
So then it's like, okay, I need to draw this out, and I need to dust off my academic lenses to really approach this in a certain way, because I was familiar with people like David Harvey and Frederick Jameson, even Zygmunt Bauman, which was back in 2000, 2001 timeframe. And I wanted to bring all this together, and by no means did I think we did an exhaustive approach to what the topic of postmodernism is. But I was hoping that I could do enough of who the main figures were in the beginning, and then a reappraisal of it sort of with Bauman's sociological analysis. So that was my whole take, and I think I accomplished my goal in the 3 episodes.
Yeah, you gave a very detailed account. Those were all very educational episodes.
Yeah. So about postmodernism itself, why it emerged or why it got the attention it did. So the first book I started off with in the first episode of the podcast was David Harvey, who is a Marxist geographer. And he's been active for many, many years. And recently he's been in the popular imagination, particularly on YouTube, with his lectures about capitalism and applying the Marxist analysis to this, particularly in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. So
Okay.
I remember that book. The book was what's it called? The Condition of Postmodernity. It came out in 91, and he was applying in the Marxist critique to what postmodernism is. And around the same time as when you had Jameson's book come out, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, where because of the shift in the configuration of what world capitalism is, particularly late capitalism, as I like to describe it, that postmodernity was, and I still retain this definition, is that it's an emergent phenomenon rather than a school of thought.
Right.
And so I also wanted to make the distinction between postmodernism and postmodernity. So in the academic literature, modernity or postmodernity, I would say, is more of the emergent phenomena. We already live in it. We're somewhat aware of it, but sometimes it's very difficult to put your finger on it. Whereas if you dub something an ism, you can point your finger at it and say, like in the case of a school of thought, a philosophy, or even a school of art criticism, or a movement, you can point to it as postmodernism. And that's where I think it becomes easy to set it up as a straw man. Versus postmodernity, you can't easily say that, because even in today's world, even in primitive societies, you have the elements of the modern, or even the postmodern. Because you have tribes in Africa that watch TV, for example. Well, modernity has already crept into them, whereas they're still existing in a sort of pre-modern state of affairs.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're that reminds me of how you're talking about liquid modernity by Bauman, that is, and how there's still remnants of the modern era that are still innate within our society.
Right. So in Bauman's take on it is we're still modern and we're still relentlessly modernizing. And in the beginning, when Intimations of Postmodernity came out, that was the smaller book. That came out around the same time that Jameson's and Harvey's book came out, is, what's all this postmodernism then? So he applied a sociological analysis to it and said the postmodern or postmodernity is what I use to describe what the emergent state of affairs are in the wake of the collapse of communism and the late stage capitalism. And then somewhere around 2000, he abandoned that and instead used the term liquid modernity to emphasize the point is that modernity is still here. It's not something that has been done away with as postmodernism or postmodernity applies. But the sands of it shift. And I like the metaphor he uses of liquid because it reminds me of the element mercury, which is the only element in the periodic table which is a metal that comes in a liquid form. At a certain temperature, it solidifies, but then in its native form, it's liquid. But yet you could say that it's still a solid.
Oh yeah, that definitely is a good analogy. And you brought up Marxists and communism there too. I'm glad you did, because that reminded me another really interesting aspect of the first episode that you and James did, was where you were talking about how a lot of the best criticisms of postmodernism come from Marxists, which helps explain why someone like Jordan Peterson throwing around a term like postmodern neo-Marxist is kind of an oxymoron. And in terms of communism, I like that you were talking about in your third episode, and also in liquid modernity, if I'm not mistaken, Bauman talks about he makes criticisms of communism. Well, capitalism too, but communism from kind of like the opposite angle that people usually do when they criticize communism. And I think the term that was used was it's capitalism on steroids, which I thought was a really interesting vantage point to look at that too.
Well, it's modernity on steroids, not capitalism.
Yeah, modernity, of course.
Yeah. So in Bauman's analysis of it, the modernizing project, you see this also in some of the Marxists like Jameson and Harvey, is to classify, to order, to rationalize in the sense of instrumental rationality, and to another one of Bauman's excellent metaphors is a gardener's job. Okay, what does a gardener do? It pulls out weeds, make sure the garden is all nice and tidy. So socialism, communism was modernity on steroids.
Yeah.
because it was to classify, it was to bring everything into the one sphere and remove the weeds. His one book, Modernity and the Holocaust, that was a very good, I think, sociological analysis about how, among other things, modernity helped contribute to how the Holocaust was able to happen on such a large scale versus genocides that had happened in years past. Because genocide has always been with us, just more on the small scale, not
Right.
on the industrial scale that had happened in Nazi Germany. And then communism more or less did the same thing, particularly with industrialization. It was trying to beat capitalism in its own game, trying to
Yeah.
industrialize. But in the process, what happened is that it despoiled the environment. And then when it finally did collapse, the people that were in it were left adrift. They weren't going to go back to being peasants like they did in the pre-modern society, but then they were left adrift in this still modernizing world without a guidepost.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So, what was it specifically about modernity that made the Holocaust and communism different from other genocides in previous history?
Well, as Bauman described it in the book, is one thing was about the stranger. That's a key concept in his thought.
Right.
Is in the past, we kind of intuitively know what a stranger is. But in the past, the stranger was somebody who came, stayed for a short time, and then went. And according to the customs of the time, you would extend the stranger a certain degree of hospitality. But you knew that the person was going to be moving on. Whereas in the liquid modern configuration, the strangers, they come, but they stay. They're not integrated into the society or the culture at large. They're kind of stateless in a way. Well, stateless is the opposite extension of that. But somebody that doesn't quite fit in and kept in a self-selecting ghetto or whatever it is that they're there, but there's never a move to incorporate them into the culture of the society. And so they're still treated as a stranger. And in Bauman's analysis, this is what happened to the Jews. They were gradually classified as strangers, removed, pushed at a distance away from, onto the periphery of society. And it was different from the ghetto because, at least in the ghetto, it was separate from the wider society, but it was self-functioning. And the Jews were herded into the ghettos, treated as the stranger. And so if you treat somebody as a stranger, there's no moral obligation to that person as a stranger. So as they were slowly being shoved over into the camp of the stranger, while modernization was taking place, particularly on the massive scale, it then became easy for ordinary people to get involved because, the Jews were the Jews, the dirty Jews. They were the strangers.
Yeah.
It's not that I knew a Jew or I grew up with somebody. It was that the Jews were of a different race, even though that was not necessarily true. But they were treated as the strangers, and then when you had the whole machine in operation, you could just round them up and exterminate them en masse.
Yeah, especially because you thought you were doing something good and moral, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at those concepts, because I think a lot of people, like a lot of the times when you hear criticisms of things like the Holocaust and communism, they look at it as if it's well, at least some people look at it as if a large part of the problem is that there weren't enough of some of the modernist aspects that we talk about, like how with communism, for example, that it's opposed to capitalism. So perhaps if there were more capitalism or more modernist concepts, then it would have been better. But it's interesting to kind of take that view and put it on its head, and like how Bauman talks about how it's actually modernism that helped allow for those things to happen, like you were saying.
Right. And you could see that even today. Modernizing, totalizing, centralizing, all of these things. This is all part of that modernizing project that still continues. So even though socialism, capitalism collapsed back in the late 80s and the early 90s, modernism has not stopped. And in fact, it seems to be going in that direction again with centralizing forces. And then when you look at people who are really campaigning hard for socialism, I can understand why somebody like Jordan Peterson would be afraid of that. That's kind of what his thing is.
Yeah.
Because he looks at the totalitarian societies of the 20th century. But then you have to get down to the nitty-gritty about, well, what is the person who wants socialism, what are they trying to do? And going back to another point about Bauman's is that, of course, one of the benefits of modernization is that it helped to alleviate existential security. Whereas in the pre-modern time, although people were more cohesive as a whole in one's culture and tribes, you could even say, it was still a fight for survival because you didn't have the bounty that you have today. You had to go farm, and if your crops failed, you were up shit creek, more or less. But modernization, although there were some trade-offs that you made by going into the city, at least you were secure enough, is that you had enough to eat. You had a small place to stay. You weren't exposed to the elements or exposed to warfare like you were in pre-modern societies. So that was the trade-off. And that's where, at the top of the first episode, I really wanted to bring in the point by Marshall Berman in his book All Solid Melts into Air, when he talks about the Faustian bargain, which is a term that you hear every so often in reference to certain kinds of trade-offs that humans have made. Is that it's kind of like selling your soul to the devil. That's where that comes from, the Faust legend. So you give up one thing for security or some other benefits, but at the same time you lose a significant part of yourself by doing that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting too that one of the key aspects of modernism is individualism, and then it's like sometimes people say like put individualism against collectivism, especially in terms of communism, for example. But one thing that I like that Bauman talks about is how the individual and the collective are both needed, and they're both part of each other too. And that kind of relates to that book you suggested to me, Complexity and Postmodernism, and talking about how we live in a complex society based on a lot of different factors. And I also like that because talking about how individualism and collectivism are both connected and necessary for living in a society, it's not one or the other. That's also something reflected by people like Jonathan Haidt, who I'm a huge fan of, particularly when he talks about it in his book, The Righteous Mind.
Okay. Yeah. So what were some of the things you like about The Righteous Mind that struck out for you?
I like mainly, I would say, the idea that it's not that like when we're talking about religious differences or political differences, it's not that you're right and moral and the other person is immoral. It's that people have different psychological values that form their political opinions, and they have these because they look at situations from particular perspectives, and other people have different values and perspectives, and that's why they have different views. And people often get opposed to each other because they look at issues from different perspectives, and then they think the other side is immoral or the other side is stupid or something like that.
Right. And so would you say that this is relativism?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, I would say, well, I mean, like, that in particular is the opposite of relativism, but basically what Jonathan Haidt advocates for is more, the term that he uses is moral pluralism rather than relativism, which to him he distinguishes between that and relativism, in a way that he says that there are many good different ways of having a worldview, but there isn't one that's completely bad and one that's completely good. But I find that agreeable too, but I personally kind of agree with more of the relativist position because our culture changes so much, and especially in different places and across history, and depending on the type of person that you are, that it's so, like, to me, it's almost impossible to say that this moral perspective is better than another moral perspective in other unless you're saying that it's something other than your feelings, because our emotions are what construct our moral compass, along with our interactions with our environment.
Okay, so I got a term I could throw out there. That's better than
Sure.
relativism.
Sure.
Perspectivalism. Yes, that is a term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, this was another point that that firped me about contemporary discussions about postmodernism, because inevitably they seem to focus on truth. Oh, there's no such thing as absolute truth. It's all relative. Again, that's
Right.
part of that straw manning, as I take it. And again, the reason why I brought in Bauman is because I wanted to circumvent that. Instead of spending so much time about truth, let's talk about the ramifications of the consequences of what has been happening, sociologically speaking, economically
Right.
speaking, over the past 20 to 30 years. And I think that's a much better approach versus obsessing about truth. That's a whole separate topic. What is truth? Does everybody have their own truths? Things like that, or relativism or perspectivalism. Let's just not even focus on that. Let's focus on something else, like the sociological. And that's why I wanted to bring Bauman in.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems like a better idea to me, for sure. Like a more helpful approach, because it's so easy to get caught up in what is true and what is moral, because we all have our individual perspectives on those particular topics, and they can vary a whole lot, and it can be really easy to talk past each other when we talk about those subjects.
Oh, for sure. And then with social media, that just amplifies
Yeah.
the fact. Whereas something that Bauman had brought up in his description of the sociological theory of postmodernity, this is from Intimations of Postmodernity, is that yes, the people can wind up talking past themselves because of a lack of proximity.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I are talking through we'll say, a high modernist channel.
Yeah.
We're on opposite sides of the country practically, but yet we're
We're
speaking.
different countries.
Yes, we're speaking face to face, but still there is some kind of a implicit. That's the word I'm looking for. Decorum and respect, that we're just having a conversation about these ideas. I'm not trying to win something over on you. No,
Right.
this is not combat. But if people are in their own echo chambers and they're not proximate, then it's no wonder why this kind of acrimony happens within social media.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's definitely a huge aspect. And like you were just talking about, that's why things like podcasts are great, because they tend to be conversations with people where you're trying to understand each other's positions and trying to learn from each other and learn what that person's perspective is, rather than just being like, "Oh yeah, I devastated that person on Twitter."
Yeah, blood sports, internet blood sports.
Yeah.
Which is why I kind of shied away from trying to do my own thing. But James has said, maybe you should try your own podcast. And
That would be awesome.
I've been thinking about it. So I got a whole stack of books over here that I haven't read in some time. So maybe I should draw them out.
Yeah, that would be great. I know, like, me and James and Hayden Bruce and plenty of other people would definitely be interested in that.
Okay, cool. Well, let's go back to Bauman for a minute. So in the third episode, I really was trying to flesh out his sociological theory, particularly in Intimations of Postmodernity and then Liquid Modernity. So I think the Intimations of Postmodernity, it's a difficult book to get a hold of, but there is a PDF copy of it. That, I think, is a really good, concise description, particularly the last chapter. That's what I was focusing on, about some of the things he was talking about in Liquid Modernity, such as the self-constitution of the agent. So I don't know if you caught on that.
Yeah, that was that was an interesting part. Would you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So, going back to how I became acquainted with Bauman, I stumbled upon. Actually, I knew about his books from some years before because I saw them in the library stacks. I remember seeing Intimations of Postmodernity and Postmodern Ethics in particular. That was in my college's library, but I never got around to reading it until I found Liquid Modernity, and I just, for the hell of it, started reading it, and I'm like, oh well, this is pretty fascinating. And one of the reasons why it was so fascinating is because I could identify with it, of what was going on. Some of his themes, one of which is in the liquid modern world, there's self-constitution. So, unlike in pre-modern societies where your identity was fixed at birth, if you were born into a certain tribe, you were born into a certain culture, you identified as French or German or Italian, and if you were part of a certain social class, your father was a blacksmith, for example, then you were a blacksmith, your identity was already pre-made. That was in
Right.
pre-modern societies. In the modern era, that started to crumble, and this is when you particularly had the emergence of the classic Marxist approach, where you had the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. That's the way it was framed. And then in the postmodern liquid modernity, it's this consumerist society. So in the consumer society, the Bauman's point is production has already been taken care of, more or less. But one is not really producing, one is consuming. So what happens in consumption? Well, in consumption is you can try on many different things. So your identity when you were 13 years old is going to be different from your identity at 25 years old, different in your 30s and 40s and 50s. But that's also, you don't have your pre-made identity, and instead you have to look to others as a clue about what kind of identity you're going to construct within whatever society you happen to find yourself in, which in the consumer society is you try on different things, just like clothes. If you're not happy with this, you try something else. If you're not happy with this job, you go to another job and things like that. So that has created some unprecedented freedom, but at the same time has heightened anxiety. And
Yeah.
I think it's just gotten worse over the past 10 to 20 years. I mean, again, the reason why I took to it is because I could identify some of that myself within what I was reading in Bauman. And yeah, who am I going to be? I don't have any clue. I mean, I could do what my parents did, but my parents, if they were of a certain age, were self-constituting themselves, and their identities shift. Take parents that divorce. First they were a couple for so long, and now they're two singletons, more or less. And are you going to do the same thing your parents did? Are you going to do the same job that your father did? Are you going to do the same job that your uncle did, or whatever it is? So it's very nerve-wracking to go through that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like
And speaking
that.
as a millennial, I don't know if you have any particular thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I would say that that sounds accurate. Like trying to figure out who you are is always a very difficult question. And yeah, you can have different life experiences and then your life can change completely years later. Like I know that's happened with me several times. Like I grew up as like a little skinny guy, and then I eventually became like a huge power lifter, and I thought I wanted to be a personal trainer for a while, and then I thought I wanted to be a historian, and then I thought I wanted to be a journalist, and now I think I want to just be a writer and be creative in a lot of different ways, like make videos and stuff like this.
So do you feel comfortable in your identity now?
No, I think I'll always be figuring out who I am.
Okay. Does it engender a certain sense of anxiety?
I would say so for sure sometimes, yeah.
Okay.
Because I feel like I should have a more strict identity, but then I'm always have like feel like I'm bouncing off the walls when it comes to that and other things.
Yeah. So also going back to Bauman's point about self-constitution is that one, the agent is looking to others who are also in their self-constituting
Right.
approach. But that, I mean, this always engenders a sense of anxiety that's at work. Because if I'm looking to you for clues about how I want to be, I can pick and choose what I want. If I
Yes.
think I'm discerning enough, but I'm not sure. You know, you were just saying that at one point you wanted to become a personal trainer. So it's like, okay, so I think I want to be a personal trainer. Let me talk to him to get an idea of what it's like. And then if I go try it out and then find out that it's really not for me or I'm not suited for it, then that engenders a sense of anxiety. It's because I failed in this
Right.
approach. Particularly if I'm unsure about myself and I'm looking for something else to do. You know, I'm not happy with myself, but I think that what you are portraying to me is something that I want to be, but then if it fails, then I'm upset with myself for that it failed. And then it's like, well, what do I do now? And the next person I go to is the same thing going to happen. That's that
Yeah.
anxiety about the self-constituting project.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like if you look to other people, like you were saying, we kind of collect characteristics that we like, but then those are going to change because we change our minds about things too. And like you were talking about earlier, with this increased access to information, it can be easier to have that state of anxiety because you always have that fear of missing out. Like, I really am really interested in this, but what about all this other stuff here and all these other distractions?
Yeah, and that even happens for people that are my age or older, because we're still in that self-constituting endeavor, even though we have many more years of life experience behind us than say somebody of your age or younger, particularly a teenager. You know, that's why I focused on who better than a teenager would be the par excellence of somebody that's really racked with anxiety about what their identity is.
For sure.
Yeah, and even more so today because of all the things that are on offer. Not to
Yeah,
mention the fact is that if they come from a broken home, you know, the parents divorced or whatever, is that their fundamental ground that they had when they were growing up has been just been shaken to its core.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like with the rise of divorce rates that we've seen, I think I was just learning recently since the 70s or so, that basically that takes away the importance of the family unit to a degree, with people breaking up their families and so on.
Right, which the nuclear family itself, you could say, was a consequence of modernity. Because
Yeah,
in pre-modern societies, you had the extended family and
right.
the wider community. The extended family was just one part of a wider community. But as modernity progressed, it shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until it was the nuclear family, which, you know, if you're an only child, particularly, it's you, your parents, and maybe a dog or some other kind of pet, and then your extended family is scattered to the four winds, and you go visit them every so often. And then if you don't have enough life experience, I mean, this is like in my case, my parents were together for 57 years. So
Oh,
looking at the landscape that exists now, I think I was one of the lucky ones. And it was really hard for me to identify with people when I was growing up in my 20s who came from a divorced family. My girlfriend is from a divorced family. Her friend is from a divorced family. Her other friend is from a divorced family. You know, she has friends that came from divorce. And a friend of mine who's an older guy was divorced from his wife. You know, so it's just seems more common, but it seems very odd to me because I didn't grow up in that
right.
environment. But again, the modernization is that it just really contracted it down to um, the nuclear family, shaky
Yeah.
ground.
I think that's an important point too, that um, that, like you were saying, the nuclear family is a product of the modern era. I know, like even myself, until I started learning more about this kind of stuff, just kind of assumed, well, maybe the idea of the nuclear family, at least like the family unit, was the main way in which people operated throughout history. But as pretty much always happens when you learn more about the context of those sorts of issues, it's much more complex than that.
Right. In my case, for my family, is that I was closer to my mom's side of the family than my dad's. And I'm still not close to my dad's side of the family, even though he came from a larger family. He was one of 7 kids.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just the bonds were never solidified back then for one reason or another. And in some ways, I regret that because my girlfriend, she's tighter with her family and her extended family, most of whom live in Italy because she
Oh,
comes from Italian parents. But she's really close with her one aunt who's in her late 80s, has been for many years. Was really close to her grandmother, and I was kind of close to my one grandma. That's it, out of all my grandparents.
oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, going back to my point I said earlier is that looking at some of what Bauman wrote, I could identify with that.
Yeah.
Viscerally and personally with that. Now, some other things he brought up with was another characteristic of liquid modernity is power structures. And not in the Foucauldian power structures, like some people like to point out. Well, it's all about power. Well, power, yeah, there's power, but there's other ways you can define it. Bauman defines power as how many options that you have in your life. If you're really constricted in what you could do, you don't have a lot of power.
Oh,
But if
okay.
you have a wider range of options that you can work with, you have more power. And of course, those that are at the top of the pyramid, they have social power, they have economic power, they have a lot of those things because of their options, but they can marshal their resources.
Right.
Now, but in liquid modernity is the ability to disengage. That's a significant key of power. Now, what do I mean by that? So going back to what I said before, you don't like your job, you quit, you go get another one. You're not bound to your employer. Even though some people would feel that they're bound to their employer, it's because if they lose their job, how long is it going to take to get another one? And am I going to be able to work at the same wage or salary that I did before?
Right.
Or are they going to have to pick up and go someplace else? Now, for somebody who feels that they have a lot of power is that they can say, I'm out of here. I'm done. And there's nothing you can do about it. I can disengage at will. And so you're the one that's stuck holding the bag versus somebody like me. Because there's no skin in the game on either side. You depend on me more than I depend on you.
Right.
And, the important point that he drew was that in heavy capitalism, that's a term they use, is when you had large corporations, large industry, and the large labor unions, either they were in a symbiotic relationship. But that started to break down in the 70s. Now you have flexible labor. You go work for one particular corporation. You can disengage from them, but they can disengage from you at any time.
Yeah.
That also increases that anxiety.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like how Bauman distinguishes between heavy capitalism and late capitalism, and we have that more of that late capitalism, or sorry, not late capitalism, light capitalism with liquid modernity.
Right. And another point to bring up about modernity is that I remember when people were talking about post-capitalist, post-industrialist, okay? So that might be true looked at a certain way, but industrialization is still alive and well. It's just not in the US. Where's it at? In China and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they are in the process of modernizing, relentlessly so. In fact, going back to the earlier point that Bauman made about communism rapidly industrializing, well, that's what the Chinese have been doing for 30 years, pretty much.
Yeah.
Really, really much more quickly than the Soviet Union did back in the day. And because of that, you really see the environmental consequences, the societal consequences of that happening.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that
Yeah.
they were doing that so much more quickly.
Yeah, because the project was, according to Bauman, is that they had to industrialize. They almost had no choice. You go back to the history of the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution was 1917. Okay. By the time you got to Stalin's time in the 1950s, they had already rapidly industrialized and collectivized. So this is why entities in the West were very nervous about the Soviet Union because of how fast it industrialized, how rapidly it did, where it posed a threat. But it kind of sowed the seeds of its own destruction, particularly with the environmental catastrophes that happened. And that's happening today in China too. So
is that because of the modernism on steroids aspect?
Yeah, because they have to industrialize to compete in the world stage, because it is kind of world capitalism and specifically consumerist. You know, lots of consumer electronics, for example. That, yeah, they're almost forced to modernize, but they're going to pay a price for it, and they're already paying a price for it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So this is where, in particular, I now tell people is that if you really wanted to get a good handle on what postmodernism is, go to the Marxists. Because probably more than anybody else, the Marxists one who have a dead-on criticism of what it is. Because again, as I take it, is that postmodernity is an emergent phenomenon of the changes in the capitalist system.
Right.
That's where you look to it. That's why you look at people like Harvey. That's where you look at people like Jameson, and where you look at people like Bauman.
Yeah.
Don't get too caught up in the whole thing about truth, post-truth, or all that other horseshit. Just look at socioeconomic approaches.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense, and that's why I appreciate Bauman, because it's like it's a much more multifactorial approach to examining how these cultural changes occur.
Right, and what the consequences are. Like, for example, increased anxiety, fractured identities, flexible labor arrangements, and so on.
Yeah.
This all contributes to this sense of postmodernity or liquid modernity, using his term.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So going back to some other points that Bauman had mentioned was the self-constituting, but then he talked about the expert. I don't know if you caught that part.
It was about how there's less praise of the expert in liquid modernity than there was.
Well, part of it. So, to summarize his position on this is, I'm the self-constituting agent. I'm looking to others for clues about how to construct my own identity. So I can look to others, but I'm uncertain of that. I can look to somebody who passes themselves off as an expert. And why are they an expert? It's because they command the most attention. And they command the most attention, they command the most power, you could say, collectively from the people that look to them. Take a perfect example is like Oprah, okay? Lots of people look to her as some kind of an expert, as a celebrity, okay?
Yeah, she got sued by, I forget what it was, but saying that she eats one particular food because it put people out of business for who produce a different kind of food from the one that she prefers, even though she wasn't disparaging that other food organization.
Right, and that's what Bauman's point is. So as the people are looking towards an expert, and the expert emerges because of the collective power that he or she has from the people that look to them and say that this person is at least credible in what they're saying. But if there's any hint, some point down the road, of lying, cheating, evading, or whatever it is from the expert, then all bets are off. Okay?
Right.
And this is what people are the most anxious about, because if I'm self-constituting and I'm looking to you, okay, now going back to the powerlifting example or the personal trainer, so I can try out what you're saying, and if it doesn't work, I'm upset with the whole state of affairs, including myself, and then I'm going to try to look to somebody else. But I might not trust the other person. It's because they don't have any kind of air of authority, whereas an expert, a self-proclaimed expert, or what people consider as an expert, might have that. So the people go to the expert and they say, oh yeah, well, another example is like Tony Robbins. Okay, I'm going to go pay X amount of thousands of dollars to sit in a Tony Robbins seminar because he is he's in the class the class of that person as an expert. Okay.
Yeah.
But if he runs into a scandal, as a lot of these experts do, and it's not just like Tony Robbins, but religious figures, they run into a scandal that's there. Well, that really pisses off the people. It's because they look to that person as a font of wisdom or direction, and now they're shown to be a fraud. So as the self-constituting agents, we're really let down by an expert because they should have been able to deliver more goods than we were expecting. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Like, oh no, my source of a moral compass and the person who's got everything all figured out and can tell me what to do isn't the person I thought they were.
That's right. Now, sure, there's people like us who could sit back and they say, "Well, you dumbass, you should have known better." But some people, they might not know better, or some people are just so anxious they're on the razor's edge
Yeah.
that if there and again, that's what Bauman's point is. If there's any hint of that, it really can spiral out of control. Particularly now that you have everything so tightly wound, and with things like social media. Back in the day, if you would have found out about a scandal, it might have taken weeks or months to find out about it. Now it's instantaneous.
Now there's a new one every week.
There's a new one every week, right? Yeah. So that's another important point that he talks about.
Definitely. Yeah.
I'm just looking through my notes here. These are the notes that I was reading with James. So if you don't mind, I could focus on a couple of those because I think
sure.
Say more succinctly than I do. Okay, here's one. So the social suffering that defines postmodernity therefore reflects relationships of consumption and consumerism. Whereas modern social suffering was defined by relationships of production, postmodern social suffering is defined by the ability of men and women to be self-constituting in the marketplace, something I've already said. This leads Bauman to replace the modern division between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat with a postmodern division between the seduced and the repressed. The seduced are those who have the resources to participate in consumerism with all the speed and lack of care for durability that endless self-constitution requires and implies. The seduced are those who have bought, and who are able to buy, into the argument of consumerism. The repressed are irrelevant to the production of consumerism, except to the extent that they take on low-paid labor. And so the main concern of the system is to keep them out, lest their presence devalues the goods and practices through which the seduced engage in self-constitution. Consumerism, then, represents a return to the dominance of utility. Everything and everyone is appreciated in terms of symbolic and use value alone.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And in terms of the repressed, I thought it was interesting that even Bauman compares talks about that idea of repression that no one had really mentioned before until Freud. So Freud had that idea of the repressed, that it's similar to when I've heard Thaddeus Russell, for example, talk about Foucault and Freud, how they have similar ideas about society and the repressed in that sense.
Right. I wouldn't bring Freud into that because Freud was talking psychologically.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Now, yes, you could make a comparison with Foucault. So Bauman's point to this is he comes up with a category. The seduced are those of us who are able to participate in consumerist society. We have the means to do so. And again, back to the earlier point is that we're self-constituting agents. So everything is on offer in the marketplace. If you don't like this, you can try this product. If you don't like this, you can try this service, and so on. So that's all the self-constituting project. And those of us who could do it are seduced. But those of us who cannot do it were termed the repressed. Now, the interesting thing about the repressed is they cannot participate, and so they're shut out. But, okay, so then the question is, what about the old Marxist tack is that there's going to be a revolution? Well, no such thing is going to take place. Why is that? Because later on, Bauman says this, that although the repressed are shut out from the consumerist activities, they still want to emulate it. So there's really no self-consciousness. That's the old Marxist term. The proletariat is a collective. It has self-consciousness. If it acts in its own interest, it can overthrow the bourgeoisie and the capitalist system. But it is shown over time, again, this is where Marxists are really perspicacious about their analysis of this, is that it changed. The old proletariat as it existed back in Marx's time is quite different than it is now. You have people that are low-paid workers or unemployed. They're part of the repressed. But yet they still want to be like the rich. They still want to be engaged as seduced are the people that, like us, who have the money and the resources who could do that. So is it any wonder is that they would not overthrow the system? Or they would not really have sufficient enough solidarity to do something about the system? That's the rub.
Right. Yeah,
that's
definitely.
The rub.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of people don't talk about, really, is, well, why don't the low-paid workers, the low-paid workers can unionize. All right, fine with that. But you're still operating within the system.
Yes.
They're not talking about maybe there's a different way to do this, or that we don't have to participate in this system. Okay, fair enough. But another problem that you had, again, with the modernizing project is that it just creeps into everything. And even James pointed out here before, is that capitalism has the magic of co-opting whatever it comes in contact with.
Yeah, that's it. That's an important point, and it can be hard to see that from that external perspective, the way modernism affects society in that way, because you wouldn't think until you take a step back and analyze it that it would affect it in that way, unless you've learned about these sorts of topics.
Right. Yeah, it takes a long time, and it takes concerted effort to really dig through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So continuing with my notes, I wanted to focus on this one topic of postmodern politics. And again, this comes from Intimations of Postmodernity. The first one in particular, because you and I talked offline a couple times about this, and this is one point that you really like, I think. The first one is tribal politics. He talks about. So I'll just read the notes. These are imagined communities that emerge out of the agent's practices of self-construction and that are aimed at collectivization. Unlike with pre-modern communities, these postmodern communities exist in no other form but the symbolically manifested commitment of their members. They can't rely on executive powers to coerce their members to toe the line to the tribal rules, or on the strength of neighborly bonds or intensity of reciprocal exchange. Most tribes, anyway, are deterritorialized, and communication is at its most intense between in-members and out-members. These postmodern tribes exist always in a state of becoming, supported by repetitive symbolic rituals of the members, but persisting no longer than how attractive these rituals are. Allegiance is composed of ritually manifested support for positive tribal tokens or the animosity to negative tribal tokens. Tribal rituals compete for the scarce resource of public attention as the major resource of survival.
I think that hits the nail right on the head for analyzing the political landscape.
Okay. So you had said before that you didn't like the tribalism that seems to emerge in politics. Okay, that's a fair point. But after what I just read about Bauman's take on it, does it seem to make more sense about why such a thing would emerge?
Yeah, and it makes more sense in terms of what I think you said on your last episode with James. It's basically that sort of tribalism is almost inevitable for the area in which we're living right now.
Right. As human beings, we're tribal. That's how we're wired.
Yeah.
That's how we evolved. Okay. So that in itself is self-evident.
Yeah.
But what is not so self-evident is when people complain about this tribalism that seems to have emerged in politics. Okay. Well, to a certain extent, that might be because of the way humans are wired. Check. Yeah. We got that. But according to Bauman's analysis, what I just read is that they're the agents, self-constituting and somewhat atomized, that are seeking collectivization. Okay, because no man is an island. No one person can exist as an atomized individual by himself for very long. They're all seeking a collective. But unlike in pre-modern times, where that collectivization was already preset and you had a pre-made identity, you knew what you were a part of. Now you're just trying to find your own collective, okay? And you're trying to do this in such a way that really relies on your limited knowledge, your limited experience. How much power do you have, resources that you could do this? if you find your tribe, we'll say, in California, but you live in bumfuck Louisiana, do you have the means to pick yourself up and go there? Okay. That's another limitation.
Yes.
But also, how attractive is this collectivization, this collective effort, this tribe? Okay. And there's no, as he says, there's no coercion. In pre-modern societies, you would have had coercion. You toe the line because you're all part of this collective and we're depending on you. But no such thing exists because these tribes are deterritorialized, meaning they're not co-located. Some members could be, but a lot of them aren't. They could be scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
And they're always becoming, and repetitive symbolic rituals. Okay, that makes sense too. And that the communication is you're in or you're out.
Yeah.
There's no middle ground. There's no middle ground. So that's why I focused on things like political parties. Gee, that's a perfect example you could focus on in terms of a tribe, a collectivization. And as I told James, is that somebody could have been born a Democrat, but then switch and they become a Republican or an independent maybe, because they don't want to associate with the Democratic tribe anymore. And they might want to go to the Republican tribe, or they just don't want to deal with it altogether. They might become libertarian or something.
Yeah.
So that's an underscoring of what he means by the tribal politics. It's just, this is a consequence of the postmodern, the liquid modern society we find ourselves in.
Yeah. And I can totally see, like, for example, especially if we're more talking about more liberal or democratic people, it's common, like with someone like me, for example, with millennials from my generation, to question religion and religious institution. So you take away that collective to an extent, and then it can and does often get filled in by political identity instead.
Right. Because as some people like to describe it, there's the religious impulse within human beings.
Yeah.
If it's not an organized religion, then it could be something else. It could be socialism, could be an economic approach. There's that some kind of religious impulse that exists within us.
Yeah, totally.
Now, when you talk about millennials, I'm just curious, is that, I'm Gen X, I'm not millennial. So do you, as a millennial, feel a sense of solidarity with your other millennials? Or is there more differences now, and it's definitely more of a salad bowl than it was maybe for Gen X, like me?
I think that it's much more differences. I don't really feel any solidarity with other millennials. I feel solidarity with people if I find that I have something in common with them.
Okay. So it seems more the case then, because Gen X, we were the first generation to be labeled as like slackers, disengaged,
Oh, okay.
and all of that. Yeah, but there's so fewer than us compared to you millennials. We were like a baby bust versus the baby boomers.
Okay.
You had the baby boomers, Gen X, the baby bust, and now the millennials. I can't speak about Gen X because I haven't followed them that closely.
Right.
Okay. So going back to the notes about postmodern politics, another point is the politics of desire. And this is establishing the relevance of certain types of conduct, tribal tokens, for the self-constitution of the agents. If the relevance is established, then seduction occurs, where the promoted conduct grows in attractiveness, and the promoted purposes turn into agents' needs. Agencies are vying with each other for the scarce resource of individual and collective dreams of the good life.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
that makes total sense.
So in essence, what he's saying is that, again, the self-constitution of the agents, their desires, if what I want, if what the agency, you could say the tribe or the collective, if there's a relevance, a relatability between the two, then seduction occurs. I want to be part of this.
Right.
And I continue this conduct because it's attractive. And then those practices then turn into my needs for that.
Right.
So all the agencies, let's go back to political parties. What are they trying to do? They're trying to get voters.
Yeah.
Okay. So There's the tribal collectivization that goes on in the political parties, but what are the politicians trying to do? They're trying to attract new voters. Here's my half-ass attempt at a platform, and I'm really going to do the media blitz. Make it attractive to you to vote Democrat or to vote Republican.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it seems like it's often like especially when people are running, it's like they base their platform in opposition to the other side from that tribalist perspective.
Right. They try smear campaigns
Yeah.
against your opponent. And some people are seduced by that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it takes time to really dig deep through to find out what that candidate's voting record has been. What's their stance on things?
Yeah.
If you can even get down to the bottom of it. Now, I know that somebody like James O'Keefe in Veritas, he's really good at catching them off guard to find out what their real positions are versus the media blitz.
Yeah.
And that ties back to that point about the expert too. Your candidate, your candidate, all nice, polished smile, and they're looking very personal, but they turn out to be a real scumbag.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you're just like, oh, I can't believe it. I can't believe that somebody that nice and somebody that polished would have turned out to be. Well, they're a politician, you dumbass. What did you expect?
Yeah. Well, and also like with the internet, it's much easier to find out what that politician is really like and kind of pull back the curtain.
That's right. That's right. Well, that is a benefit for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So the next point, politics of fear. So modern fears were related to totalitarianism, while postmodern fears arise from the uncertainty regarding the soundness and the reliability of advice that the politics of desire promote. There are often fears that the agencies which are promoting their visions are either oblivious or negligent of the ill effects of those visions, particularly for self-constituting relating to the body. There's the fear of something harming the body, for example, disease outbreaks, endemics, toxic waste, and pollution. So that was another point that I forgot to bring up.
Yeah.
In Liquid Modernity, there's a long passage that really fleshes this out about fitness versus health. But the earlier point that Bauman talks about is, although the agent is always self-constituting, the one thing that persists is the human body. Okay, and the body is the one thing that shows the after effects, the scars, if you will, of the self-constitution. Okay, so like in your case, you said you were a skinny kid, then you became a power lifter. Okay, so your identity has changed, has been fluid, but you see the results in your body of what you did. You change in your identity at that time.
Yep.
Yeah. Not to mention the fact is that you got tattoos, and that's another manifestation of that. In fact, in one of Bauman's his last book, which is going to be coming out later this year, it's called Born Liquid, and it's a conversation with a guy a third of his age, a millennial guy in his 30s. Bauman died when he was 92.
Right.
To talk about things like, well, what is it for somebody like you who really know nothing more than the liquid modern age? So, and I'm curious, why did you get yourself tattoos? And why did you get so many?
Well, my first one here, I guess I got it when I first turned, around the time when I first turned 18 to celebrate becoming an adult, really. And none of the tattoos that I got have any significant meaning. I really literally just got them because they looked cool and I appreciate the artwork. Like I got this shark over here because I thought it looked really cool too. And the only one that has any sort of meaning whatsoever is this this spider on the spider web there. It says 2008 there because I got it instead of a grad ring when I graduated from high school, because I figured if I get a ring, it'll probably end up being collecting dust in a box somewhere eventually.
That's a good way to look at it. So the one on your left shoulder, what's the significance of that?
This one?
Yeah, the one you said after high school?
Yeah, I got it. I basically got it when I first became an adult, and yeah, I mean, I just got it because I thought it looked really cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So going back to Bauman's point is that this is something that persists on the body.
Yeah.
Now, what he was getting at with the politics of fear is that the agencies that are trying to seduce new members from coming in, they might outright lie about what they're trying to do. Happens in certain cases. Or they might be oblivious to the fact is that what they're promoting is going to have negative consequences down the road. And in particular, he focuses on the body, the ill effects that happens with the body. It could be disease outbreaks, yes, pollution, violence even, all those things. And sure, at a base level is that you're most concerned about your physical safety.
Yeah.
Yeah, your identity is kind of secondary to that. But, the other point is, I'm not going to read the passage, but it's a really good one, is the distinction he made between fitness and health. So that was one point that really resonated with me when I first read it, is that you can take health to be, one is in a healthy state of mind, healthy state of body. That could look many different ways. Okay, some people are larger, some people are smaller, some people are younger, some people are older. But if you could say, yes, I'm in good health, and you have some physical markers to that, that's one thing. Fitness, on the other hand, is, in his definition, the fitness to participate in the liquid modern consumerist society.
Right.
Okay. Case in point, supplements, workout regimes, cosmetic surgery, things like that. These could all fall under fitness. These allow you to continue to play the game. So fitness and health aren't necessarily the same thing. They might overlap at some point. You could be fit and you could be healthy. But just because you're fit also doesn't mean you're healthy. You could be physically fit, but you could be mentally unstable. But yet you're still able to participate in the consumerist game.
Yeah.
That's what his point is.
That definition of fitness almost sounds more like adaptiveness, almost like more of an evolutionary definition in a sense.
Right. That's an excellent point. Is the fitness, can you adapt and can you, again, continue to survive and consume, operate in that? Right. Because, at some point, if you can no longer do that, you might become one of the repressed.
Yeah.
You're shut out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's nobody more shut out from it than somebody who is a stranger, the earlier point, and who's stateless.
Yeah, exactly.
They exist in a no man's land.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so then the last point is the politics of certainty. The search for social confirmation of one's choices. We touched on this before. Within the multitude of patterns on offer and the awareness that whichever course one chooses, this is temporary and until further notice. Experts are the ones who are tasked with producing certainty. Again, touched on this before. But what the experts offer can seldom be put to the test of their validity and effectiveness. The self-constituting agents must take things on trust. Therefore, what the experts are always actively engaged in is the production and manipulation of trust.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense too.
So you could even say that another casualty of postmodernity and liquid modernity is the degradation of trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can't have a functioning society unless there's trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if experts are seen to be manipulating trust, just that hint, as I had said before, of any kind of lying or cover up, all bets are off.
Yeah.
Not to mention the individual to individual. When I encounter you, I take things on trust. You could be lying to me, but there's no way that I prove that.
Right.
And that's a one-to-one. And something else that Bauman focuses on when he brings in Levinas about the face-to-face in the ethical dimension is, trust figures into that. Whereas in pre-modern societies, you were part of a greater collective. So that trust was already built in.
Right.
But individual to individual, particularly across cultures and across languages and across religious beliefs or whatever it is, that trust can really be hard to come by.
Yeah, definitely. When you don't have those societal structures that are organized around trust in a sense is so much that can be much more difficult.
Yeah. And when you talk about ethics and morality, you're relying less on ethics and more on morality.
Yeah.
But there's different moralities. In one culture, it's okay to cheat, but in the other culture, it's not. If you come from the culture of cheating and I come from the culture of solid trust, where's the middle ground? See?
Yeah. Can be hard to find.
Yeah. So these are just some of the main points that I drew from the sociological analysis that Bauman gives. Do you have any further comments on those?
No, I think that pretty much explains all those topics really well.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears then. Let's talk about Paul Cilliers. So I sent you over that one book, which is from the late 90s. And this was, Paul Cilliers was a South African theoretical physicist. Yeah, I think it was.
Oh, okay.
And he co-opted sort of postmodernity for complexity theory.
Right.
Okay. So the basics of complexity theory is that we live in a complex world. There are many different events that some of them overlap and some of them are influenced by others. But it's an acknowledgement that things are complex. Things are not as simple as they seem. And so I didn't read the whole book. I focused a little bit on the chapter on postmodernism. I think this was another good attempt to try to take postmodernism out of it's a truth claim type of thing, that discussion. And that postmodernity is just increasing complexity because of the modernizing project.
Right.
Yeah. How do you address it? One can't say. That's the challenge.
Yeah, exactly, because you don't have the same reference points anymore.
No. You have to try to find your own reference points.
Yeah.
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 So, that's really all I got to say about postmodernity or liquid modernity in case you got anything else.
Okay.
I think I've exhausted everything that I could say about Bauman. We could go back to some of the other ones we talked about, James and I, in the first two episodes, if you want.
Yeah, sure, if you want to. And I also wanted to talk about what you suggested is a sociological perspective on porn in the postmodern era as well.
The sociological perspective of porn.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you could start with that.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it seems to me like, well, I guess porn it's obviously a very new thing, and it seems to me like it kind of clashes against the kind of puritanical values of more of the modern era. So like there's a social stigma against viewing pornography, and with the internet it's basically available at your fingertips all the time. So it's something that is enjoyable, but you can feel guilty about it too. But then, so it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing to do, and if you want to do that and enjoy yourself, that can be fine. But then also people can get carried away and people can get addicted to it and develop problems because of that. But I think part of that might be due to the social stigma against it too. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I can approach it first because at the top of this conversation, you wanted to talk about the simulacra.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's in Baudrillard. I can start off by saying that among postmodern thinkers, Baudrillard is a good one to look at, although he gets carried away himself, just the way he describes things. And the term he used was hyperreality. So this is another term we found in Albert Borgman, who we discussed in the second episode. So we've already taken a good crack at what postmodernism, actually postmodernity is, or liquid modernity, as a sociological phenomenon. Now we can shift gears and go a little bit more back to more philosophical approach. Okay, so Baudrillard's big thing was about signs. He talked a lot about that. and about hyperreality. And as I covered in the second podcast with James, I gave the stages of a sign according to Baudrillard. So there's 4 different stages. The first one is the sign itself. Okay, so a sign is supposed to have a one-to-one referent in the objective world. Something stands for something else. Okay, that's the first stage. The second stage is when the sign becomes decoupled from that thing. So it once referred to something, but now it might not refer to that, or it's degraded. The best example that I could come up with is Greek Orthodox icons. Ever been in a Greek Orthodox church? You see a lot of icons, you don't see many statues.
No, I've never been in one.
Okay, so that's central in the Greek Orthodox Church is the icons. So you have icons of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, some of the saints, and so on. And what the icon is supposed to do is a representation of that particular figure. Now, just like in the case of a statue, there's not a one-to-one referent anymore. That person, particularly in a statue, say a bust of Plato, okay? Whoever sculpted the bust probably had it in his mind what Plato had looked like. But the bust could have been made many hundreds of years after Plato died, Aristotle or some other historical figure. So there's not that one-to-one representation. Now, in the case of the icon, we don't know what the Virgin Mary looked like. We don't know what Jesus looked like, really. But those are a representation of that figure. So the icon is a sign of the personage, but there's no one-to-one referent. Or that the belief is that the icon is kind of a representation of something in the beyond, kind of the objective world. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. But again, the icon is decoupled from that. It's not a one-to-one strict representation. So the third step in the progression is when the sign really becomes degraded and it has no referent anymore. Okay, the sign might have represented something at one point, but now it no longer does, and there's no loose connection between that thing anymore. A sign is just a sign. And then the fourth and final step is the simulacrum, which is something that is a sign, but is taken as real in and of itself.
Okay.
Okay. So let's look at let's go back to the porn example. Okay. So the problem that one would encounter with porn is that it's a simulacrum.
Okay.
Okay. Meaning, it exists in and of itself. You use it as a masturbatory aid. It's not a real woman.
Yeah.
Or people that are on the screen. Now, the people that are on the screen, there might have been a referent at one point, but let's say that the porn movie is like 30 to 40 years old. It was made in the 70s. So those people might not be alive, but you're still using it as an erotic aid in and of itself. So you could call it a simulacrum. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So then the thing about hyperreality is that there is a real that exists objectively, but it is not seen because the signs themselves, the simulacrum, are taken as real.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense.
Okay, so that's about hyperreality, which is that the simulacrum are treated as real, and they are real. Maybe not objectively real, but they're taken as real.
Right.
Yeah. You could even say it in TV or what you see on the internet. Everything that you see there, you don't put full stock in it, at least if you were discerning enough. You don't put full stock in it because you know that it's a representation of something else. It could be a representation of something that actually existed, or it could be just a representation in and of itself. But some people take it as literal, as objectively real.
Right.
And that's what hyperreality is. So that's where I think the dangers of porn could come in.
Right. Yeah, because you can see it as more of your own personal objective reality.
Right. Right. Now, of course, there's so much porn that's on offer is that you can pick and choose what you want, versus in the past, you were limited in your choices.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in the way that's a good thing, but in another way it's not such a good thing. It's because you have a lot of perverse porn that's out there.
Yeah.
It caters to everybody's desires, no matter how sick and twisted they might be.
Yeah.
That's where the danger comes in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's an unintended consequence. That's another thing about postmodernity that not a lot of people like to focus on, is that of the unintended consequences that happen to modernization.
Yeah, that's one thing that I like about Bauman. He talks about the unintended consequences of modernity a lot, and I think that's probably especially important to understand for people who criticize postmodernism based on those strawmans, because they tend to talk about how postmodernism advocates for all sorts of different things. But if you're looking at Bauman, for example, he's talking like you were saying about some of the unintended consequences of the postmodern era.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's my take on porn.
Okay.
But you could easily take the simulacrum analysis to lots of other things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see how that would be the case. What are some other examples?
Well, let's look at The Matrix. That would be a classic example. And this is something that James and I talked about, is when I first saw The Matrix, when did it come out, in 99? Gosh, that's almost 20 years now. I thought it was a clever science fiction story, but me being trained in philosophy with like the brains in the vats type of thought experiment, I'm just like, I've seen this before. Reality's a simulation. Yeah, okay. I've seen this before. All right. It's nothing earth-shattering, but for guys like you, people your own age, this was just like, whoa, man! I never considered that reality might have been a simulation. Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Unless you smoked a lot of weed and did PCP back in the
day. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
and one of the things that I like about The Matrix, especially when you look at the whole trilogy, is, well, I like, for example, the on the Blu-ray you can watch The Matrix with philosopher commentary on it.
Yeah.
One of them is Cornel West, and I forget who the other guy is, but when I was telling Hayden Bruce about this, he was saying that guy's a pragmatist, and I like it because they examine the movie from a philosophical and a political and a mythological perspective, and especially when you look at the whole trilogy, I like when I watch them now, looking at them from a mythological perspective, and from the perspective of different mythologies that the Wachowski brothers kind of combined with different philosophies and different political philosophies too.
Yeah, you know that Cornel West is actually in one of them.
He's what? Oh yeah, he's in The Matrix Reloaded and Matrix Revolutions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice little cameo right there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with those series of books, Fill in the Blank and Philosophy, collections of essays.
Oh,
have you ever seen those?
I have, yeah. I've never actually read any of them, though.
Yeah, I haven't either, but there's one, The Matrix and Philosophy.
Yeah, that is one that I've been interested in. I remember seeing one on Inception and philosophy, too, which also sounded interesting.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've never seen Inception.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I guess I got to put that on my list of things to see. I just don't watch very many movies anymore.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it's great. It's probably my favorite Christopher Nolan film. I don't know if you've seen any other Christopher Nolan films.
Yeah, The Dark Knight, of course.
Yeah, that's probably that trilogy is they're probably his most popular movies, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. But going back to The Matrix, the reality is a simulation type of a thing. That's as I said, that was nothing new.
Yeah.
To me, and that's also, I think, it was a good hat tip, because in the first movie, when Neo is in his apartment and he pulls that book off the shelf, that's Baudrillard's book.
Yeah, Simulacrum and Simulation. Yeah, Simulation and Simulacra. Sorry, yeah.
So, but the whole Matrix is an example of the hyper real.
Yeah,
you could say, because there is an underlying reality, as Neo comes to find out later on after he takes the red pill. But his whole reality in itself, the hyper-real, he had already lived in before he met Morpheus.
Right. Yeah.
So the simulation is taken as real, even though it is not objectively real.
Yeah. Because you're so immersed within it that you can't see that it's a simulation.
Right. And you could even say the same thing about postmodernism. I mean, in formulating in my head how I was going to describe it, as I think about David Foster Wallace, you know who he was, the novelist?
Name sounds familiar, but I don't think I'm familiar with his work.
Yeah, he was a novelist. He unfortunately committed suicide a few years ago. And he's classified as like a postmodernist writer. But on YouTube, you can find his one college address where it's called "This Is Water," and he begins it where he's talking about two fish that are swimming, and the one, I forget exactly how the story goes, but the one fish asks the other, says, "What do you think of the water today?" And the other fish says, "What's water?"
Right. Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, because you're swimming in it and you're oblivious to it, and that's
Right.
what I think is a better way to describe postmodernity.
Yeah.
We're already in it, just like we're already in we're already in modernity, and modernity continues because there's nothing else past it. And on another note is that in one of Bauman's lectures, he cites Antonio Gramsci, the one Marxist, where he talked about the interregnum. In fact, let me find the quote here. Antonio.
What's the interregnum?
Yeah, about the interregnum.
What is that?
So interregnum is a term to describe, to pick it apart as inter meaning between, regnum meaning reign, such as the reign of a king. Perfect example is like in the English Civil War. So when Oliver Cromwell was the ruler of England, from the time that they deposed the king until the Restoration, this was described as the interregnum because there was no monarch.
Oh, okay.
So that's what that means.
Okay.
And quote from Gramsci is, okay, so this is from the Prism Notebooks. Quote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear."
Okay.
Okay, so this is one quote that Bauman used, is that we're existing in postmodernity and liquid modernity because we're going from the pole of modernity, collapse of socialism, communism, to what maybe is going to come after liquid modernity, but it hasn't happened yet, or so we're in that interregnum.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I like that quote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really helps explain it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've said all I can say about porn. What else?
Okay.
We've reached the climax on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that's all I was thinking of, really. Although you had suggested before getting into discussing the Unabomber. However, you sent me his manifesto, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay. Sure, I can talk a little bit about the Unabomber. So, if you do get a chance, read the manifesto.
I do plan on it, yeah.
Okay. Also to the listeners, take a chance. Now, I think we could credibly say that Ted Kaczynski was nuts.
Yeah.
But he was an extremely intelligent man. I mean, he was a theoretical mathematician, after all.
Yeah.
And I kind of remember when the bombings happened. So the Unabomber was found out to be Ted Kaczynski. He mailed bombs to certain academics, mathematicians or scientists, that some of them, I think, died because of these. And these were just random bombs that he'd done over the course of like 15 years or something. I do know that David Galertner of Yale University was one of the targets, but he survived. And David Galertner is a computer scientist. He's written on that subject for many years.
Okay.
So he published a manifesto under the pseudonym The Unabomber, where it was a criticism of industrial society. And trying to summarize what his arguments were is that the increase of modernization, the increase of the technological society has not delivered on its promise. That although we now exist in a world where there's abundance, and especially nowadays where most everything is connected, it does not really increase the well-being or the happiness of people that are within it. In fact, it's increased things like depression, substance abuse, feelings of disengagement, lack of meaning, and something like that. So he advocated a destruction of that technological society. He also criticized leftism as one of the emergent phenomena of this technological society. I'm not going to get into too many of the points there. Just read the manifesto itself. And yeah, the reason why I mentioned him is because he, you could say, as another critic of postmodernity, what he termed postmodernity, the technological society.
Yeah. Well, and I think also when talking about that, it seems from what I've heard about him when he talks about that anyway, that he brings up some valid concerns in terms of technology, like you were talking about how with the internet age, it decreases or tends to decrease our face-to-face communication, and we're communicating much more with text on a screen in the form of social media.
Right.
And this was not like social media was after Ted Kaczynski was talking about that.
Right. He was active in the 90s. Mm-hmm. This was long before Facebook.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, he had some valid points, but then he just got completely carried away with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Those are my thoughts on Ted Kaczynski.
All right. Well, if you want to, I know you were also seeing, you saw my discussion with James and Hayden. So if you want to, we could also get into Stoicism and pragmatism a little bit if you want, or we could do that in another chat, because I know you like to do a detailed examination.
Yeah, I have to confess that I haven't looked at the Stoics in a long time.
Oh, okay.
And it's good that there's a lot more material out there, like Greg, one of James's, the one he chatted with, Greg Sadler, who I've been following. Yeah, so he's done some really good work on Stoicism. And in fact, I have, looking at my bookshelf, the Stoic Reader that I have to go through. This is more, just one thing about the Stoics, because I listened to the other interview you did with the one guy who was out in California, is that...
Bill Ferriolo.
Bill Ferriolo, yeah. So I like the Stoics, but what I fear is happening with the Stoics is that they're now becoming mainstream. And I've seen a lot of books over the past few years about how to be a Stoic or how to live a Stoic life or these kind of things. Whereas, what I got on my shelf is more academic, which is, let's look at, what did the Stoics say about logic? What did they say about metaphysics? What did they say about the cosmos? What did they say about God even? Things like that. So this is the wider philosophical approach that the Stoics took versus, hey, how can you be 365 days of a Stoic? That type of thing. With this mass marketing self-help type of bullshit.
Yeah.
That's where I really got to take some time and go back to the original sources and read through it, and so I can have a more informed opinion on this.
Well, yeah, reading like some of the original Stoics, like Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Zeno, that's all very interesting to do for sure.
Yeah, don't forget about Cleanthes and Chrysippus.
Yes, I'm actually reading right now a book called Fragments of Zeno and Cleanthes. So that's really interesting because it helps provide some more context on how Stoicism started in the first place.
Right. There's also Sextus Empiricus.
Yeah.
He's the chief skeptic, ancient classical skepticism, but yeah, he has some references into the Stoics. So this is all those overlapping and entwining threads with what the Stoics were within ancient philosophy as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah.
instead of cherry picking certain things to make a self-help manual.
Yeah, of course. And one thing I've been learning more about recently as well is uh, Diogenes and the Cynics, and then obviously other types of cynics that agreed with him about some things and disagreed with him about some things, led into the Stoics. And then there's more of a different range of perspectives that you find when you investigate any philosophy, really, like we were talking about, like how I've also been learning from Hayden Bruce about pragmatism as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an idea for a future podcast. Is somebody that I forgot to cover related to postmodernism is Richard Rorty,
Okay.
who is probably one of the more well-known pragmatists in recent years versus the triad of Peirce, James, and Dewey. And Rorty also engaged with postmodernism somewhat back in the 90s. He was active mostly in the 80s and 90s as collections of essays there. Hayden probably knows about him. So that might be a good this whole postmodernity talk is a good branch to go off into another discussion about pragmatism. Maybe we could get all three of us on, or even James too.
Yeah, that would be a great idea, man.
Let's have a roundtable.
Yeah, let's plan that. I'm sure James and Hayden would love to do that, because I know they're obviously big fans of yours as well.
Oh, well, I'm flattered. I mean, like I told James, I try to be thorough, and it's a fault of mine. It's something that I noticed in myself when I was doing my thesis and my master's program, is that I wanted to cover all the bases, but there's some point where you have to stop and you have to start writing.
Yeah.
And it got so bad that I had to take a break from writing it because I was just so burned out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can imagine.
But the flip side of that, it was, the time that I spent in the libraries being aware of all the literature that's out there, is if I needed to refer to it at some point in the future, I seem to have a really good memory for this, I can go back and say, oh yeah, I remember that book. Or I can just, and I have enough of the conceptual apparatus and the training to really dig down deep into that, to find the connections and say, no, this guy's full of shit, or this guy really was talking about something important, and this is another little take on that. Because ever since I was in grad school, there's been a slew of other books that have come out on a whole range of topics, not just on continental or analytic philosophy, but on things like metaethics, even metaphilosophy, which is another topic I'd like to get into more often, the philosophy of philosophy.
Yeah, I don't think I've gotten into that at all.
Yeah, argumentation, how does one construct an argument, or what does it look like? What are the other ways to persuade somebody? Its connection to rhetoric, all those things.
Right.
Yeah, just the methodology.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but maybe that's for a future podcast.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea to have all four of us, you, me, Hayden, and James. I'm sure that would be a great idea, and I'm sure they'd be up for it too.
Okay. Well, let's set something up sometime in the next couple of months.
Yeah, that sounds great, man.
Okay. Yeah. So did you have any other further questions or comments about what we covered at Postmodernity, or what James and I covered in our marathon session?
No, not that I can think of. I mean, if I was taking notes on your podcast, I'm sure it'd have like pages and pages of questions. But yeah, those are the questions that I thought of off the top of my head anyway.
Okay. Well, did you find it informative? Was it very enlightening? And do you have a better grasp about postmodernity that you can, I told James, do you feel that you can now do battle with these idiots that like to straw man postmodernity? He says, I'm glad, because I don't have to do this. I know this. Yeah.
I actually was thinking about doing that too. Like, just instead of getting into these arguments, because often they seem to end up being fruitless, just say, well, here are some books by postmodernists. You can find them for free online. Read them. A lot of them, especially by people like Foucault and Derrida, tend to be really short, like a few hundred pages. And here's this 9 hours of Tim Keefe and James Sullivan talking about it in detail.
Yeah, or even Bauman, because like I told James, is that when liquid modernity came out in 2000, it was an upgrade of Intimations of Postmodernity. So if nothing else, And there's another book that was in that period. It was called Postmodernity and Its Discontents, where he fleshed out more about the seduced and the repressed, and about the tourist and the vagabond, which you later found in Liquid Modernity. But ever since Liquid Modernity until he died, he wrote 12, 15 books that were just constantly fleshing out those themes, and they become a little bit more conversational, not so academically focused. And some of them are just collections of interviews that he had
Oh,
on
okay.
different subjects.
Yeah, you mentioned in your last episode with James that it would be a good idea to read like everything by Bauman, or all of those 12 to 15 books, and I think I will probably slowly do that.
Yeah. Yeah, pay attention to that last one, Born Liquid, because that really focuses on, because he talks about things like tattoos and internet dating and stuff like that. This is just the people that were born in the liquid modern society, the manifestations of what their behaviors are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
hmm Yeah. So that's my parting recommendation.
All right. I'm writing that one down. Okay.
I can
All right.
send you the link for it too.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thanks.
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
that's all I got.
All right. Well, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate you talking to me. And yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to talking again. And we'll arrange a talk with Hayden and James there too. I'm sure they'd be up for it. And I think Hayden was asking me about talking with you anyway. So that
Okay.
sounds great.
Well,
So
let me go. Yeah, let me go back and do my reading in pragmatism, so I'm more up to speed on this before I start talking with him about that.
for sure, for sure.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, thanks so much for talking to me. And I'll just say all the things I like to say at the end of my videos here. And then if you want, you can offer any plugs you have or anything. I guess you don't really, but what I will do, actually, I was going to do this anyway, is add the links for your conversations with James too, because if people watching this haven't listened to those, that's a great idea to do.
Sure. I'd also like to send along, and just give me some time to compile a bibliography of
Yeah.
some of the books that he and I covered in particular, but also some of the ones, because I mean, in the case of like Lyotard and Baudrillard, particularly Baudrillard, there's a lot of books that he wrote too, some of which are important, others that are not so important. And
Right.
then all of Bauman's books, particularly
Right.
from Liquid Modernity on, those are important too. But give me some time to compile one, and I can send it along to you. You put it in the show notes.
Awesome. Sounds great, man.
Okay.
All right. So, yeah, thanks everyone so much for watching another episode of the Mindgasms Podcast. Looking forward to having another chat with Tim Keefe, and probably also Hayden and James, about different types of philosophy. And yeah, as I always say, thank you so much to everyone who has subscribed to my channel and who likes this video, and to everyone who's contributed to me on Patreon. And thank you so fucking much to anyone else who subscribes to my channel or likes this video or contributes to me on Patreon. It really means a lot to me, and it helps me be able to do more videos and more creative stuff like this. And as I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, keep having mindgasms, everyone. Any closing thoughts there, Tim?
Read philosophy and take the time to do it.
Yes, it's very important. I see that more and more as a problem, especially with public intellectuals and people talking about them in our political landscape and our cultural landscape. All right. So, yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone, and adios until next time.